in the class, so that at the end I will. So I think we should record this revision so that at the end we would upload a video for all those who couldn't make it to this class. So today we are looking at all that we have done for the semester in a sort of revision. And we had started the semester by discussing speech acts. So we had said that a speech act is any utterance at all you make that has a certain function, a certain language function, or a certain communication function, a certain function in communication. So once there's something you can say that has a function, a communicative function, then we call it a speech act. The point is to know what type of speech act is it. And we looked at the types. We saw interrogative, which are sentences. We saw imperatives, which are, utterances we make when we want someone to do something for us. We saw declaratives, which are utterances we make when we want to provide information to people. And under the declaratives, we saw the factual statements, value judgments, definitions, arguments. For the factual statements, we saw that it's an expression that conveys information. Any expression that conveys information about the state of affairs in the external world, So if it is true, it is true if it is accurate. If the facts are accurate, and if it is false, if the factual information is inaccurate. You can verify it by checking the facts or verifying the facts. Then for the definitions, we say they are sentences spoken to convey information about meaning of a word. So the function of definitions is to provide meaning. We saw, in a follow-up class, which is the second class of the semester, we saw different kinds of definitions. But here we just introduced it. Then we saw value judgment. Value judgment, utterances we make to convey our preferences and values. They are value judgments. And we saw that there are both moral and non-moral value judgments. We saw emotive expressions, which are sentences that express feelings. When you express your feeling, you are uttering an emotive expression. Then the sentence fragments are sentences that are not complete, incomplete sentences. Either they are lacking a noun or a verb. And then we did some exercises. And from there we did the definitions in more detail. And for the definitions, we saw different types. But there was something we did in the definitions which was not very prominent. So I'll just use this opportunity to highlight it again. At the beginning of our treatment of definitions, we talked about two kinds of meanings, connotation and denotation. Something can have a connotative meaning, and the same thing can also have a denotative meaning. So connotation is the descriptive meaning of words, like the dictionary definitions. Definitions that are descriptive, that is, any definition you can write down or you can pronounce is descriptive. That's a connotative meaning of a word. But the denotative meaning of a word is the example of that word in the world, in the external world, in the real world. So when you're talking about something, and then you point to examples in the real world, that's the denotative meaning. That's a denotation of that thing. So connotation is descriptive meaning. Denotation is like the what do you call it? The proofs or the items. The items represented by the word, the examples of the word. Then having seen those two kinds of meanings, we saw definiendum and definiens. The definiendum is like the subject, definiens is like the predicate. Definiendum is that part of the sentence that is being defined. Definiens is that part of the sentence that is defining the definiendum. Then we saw types of definitions. We saw lexical definitions, dictionary definitions. We saw ostensive definitions, which are those definitions that you cannot describe. Those definitions that have only denotative meanings. Those definitions you can only describe by those definitions you can only those things you can only talk about by pointing to examples, like color words such as yellow, red, green. You can't describe those things. They have no descriptive meaning. If you want to let someone know what yellow is, you can only refer to the denotative meaning. That is, you can only point to a yellow object and tell the person this is what yellow means. So those are ostensive definitions. Then you have the theoretical definitions that originated from specific disciplines. You have something like inflation, which came from economics, bipolar disorder, whose definition came from psychology. You have viral load, which we got from biochemistry, and so on. Then we have the stipulative. The stipulative is a definition we create ourselves. When you create a definition for yourself, for a purpose, you say, okay, that you are not satisfied with previous definitions of this thing, or that there are no definitions of this thing at all. Then you create one. That's a stipulative definition. And we have operational definitions that involve a set of actions or operations that, when accomplished, will determine the entity referred to by the term. So then we have the essential definitions, which we say that the only definitions that are accurate, any definition that is not essential is not accurate. Then we discussed some problems with definitions. We said the definition could be too broad if the definitions refers to objects or denotations or properties that are beyond those that are needed to define the definiendum. In other words, if the items denoted in the definitions go beyond what is needed to define the definiendum accurately, then the definition is too broad. When you say a toy is a machine refers to much more than toys. So defining a toy as a machine is too broad, because the items denoted by machine are much larger than toys, much broader than toys. Okay, so then if a definition is too narrow, then the definition fails to capture the full range of items needed to define a definiendum. In this case, one realizes that the definition lists few items than is denoted by the definiendum. A toy is a tiny car used by infants to play. A toy is a tiny car. Now, tiny cars are not the only toys. There are toys that are not tiny cars. So defining a toy as a tiny car is too narrow, because there are many toys beyond tiny cars. So tiny car does not represent the full range of items that are represented by toy. Then the definition is vague if there's no way of telling what class of things the definition refers. Democracy is a kind of government where there's freedom for all. Freedom for all. The all is vague, so the definition is vague. Ambiguous. The definition is ambiguous if the definition presents more than one possible meaning of the definiendum. The sentence is ambiguous if it lends itself to more than one distinct interpretation. Okay. So then we have secularity. A definition is secular if the definiendum appears in the definiens. Or if the definiendum repeats the definiens. Sorry, if the definiens repeats the definiendum. Morality is to be morally right, Metaphysics is systematic study of metaphysical issues. and things like that. Pentagon is a figure having the shape of pentagon. So those definitions are secular. Definition begs the question if the definition is obscure or digresses from providing meaning or does not help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. Jubilee House is the office where every Ghanaian would want to be. So the correct definition should be Jubilee House is the name given to the office of the President of Ghana. So Jubilee House is the office where every Ghanaian would want to be, digresses from defining Jubilee House. So it begs the question of what Jubilee House means. That's a definition that begs the question. When a definition digresses, then it is begging the question. So then we saw discourses. For the discourses, we saw the types of passages. We're saying that any collection of sentences that appear together is a passage or a discourse. And there are different kinds of passages or discourses. We have narratives, we have argument, we have instructional passage, we have polemical rhetoric. We say that a discourse, an argument, if it contains a claim or conclusion that is supported by reasons, supported with reasons or information. And an argument contains at least two items: a conclusion, which could also be a claim or decision, and then expressions aimed at providing support or proof for the conclusion, claim, or decision. So these are the two main parts of an argument. And then we gave an example of an argument. You see two premises supporting a conclusion, or rather, you can say that you see a conclusion that is being supported or defended by two premises. So you have a conclusion, and then you have two premises supporting, defending, the conclusion. Then we saw how to identify arguments. We saw premise indicators, conclusion indicators, but we're saying that not all arguments contain these indicators. There are so many arguments without them, so you don't need to rely on indicators before you can identify an argument. Then we saw non-arguments. Not every passage is an argument. So there are some passages that are non-arguments, such as narratives, instructional passages, rhetorical polemic, or opinion. For narrative is a passage that reports a sequence of events according to the order of the events. So a story is a narrative. Any story is a narrative. Instructional passage is just a collection of imperatives. Then we have the rhetorical polemic, the passage that communicates a strong feeling. So rhetorical polemic is usually a collection of emotive expressions, and sometimes there could be a claim among them, among the emotive expressions. That is a claim situated somewhere among the emotive expressions, to at least to make a sense, to give a sense to the emotive expressions, why the emotive expressions are coming. Then we looked at the difference between verbal and real disputes. We said a verbal dispute is a disagreement about the meaning of a word or words. So when an argument, when there's a disagreement, because one party doesn't understand the true meaning of a particular word, then it's a verbal disagreement. We don't regard it as a real disagreement. That man is a Fanti. No, he's an Akan. So the second person doesn't know that a Fanti is an Akan. That's not a real disagreement. We call it a verbal disagreement. All you need to do is to say, oh, a Fanti is an Akan, and then the argument disappears. Then we saw real disputes. Real disputes are either factual disputes or value disputes. Disputes about facts or disputes about values. Accra is the capital of Ghana. No, Kumasi is the capital of Ghana. That's a factual dispute. Accra should be the capital of Ghana. No, Kumasi should be the capital of Ghana. Or Accra should not be the capital of Ghana. That's a value dispute. Those are the real disputes. Then for our next lecture, we looked at the differences between the normative and empirical. Sorry, let me see if it is here. Normative and empirical. So we rehashed the differences between values and facts. We're saying values about what we should or should not do, facts about what is or is not. So we looked at the fact that some factual statements could actually be value statements. Sometimes we mistake values of facts. There are factual statements with implicit value judgments. Example, look at the difference between the two statements. The president has lifted a lockdown. The president has rightly lifted a lockdown. The second one is a value judgment. The first one is a factual statement. The difference between the two is that rightly was inserted in the second one. Okay. Then, so the lesson is that we should be careful when we're looking at sentences. You could be given a sentence to tempt you into concluding it's a factual statement, but if you read the sentence carefully, you could find out that the sentence is actually a value judgment, not a factual statement. So it tells you to be more careful when you are analyzing sentences. Then metaphors and proverbs. These are expressions that don't lend themselves to logical analysis. First of all, metaphors just make representations that you cannot interpret literally. Don't judge a book by its cover, or it's raining cats and dogs. You know it can never rain cats and dogs. So that's why metaphors don't lend themselves to logical interpretation. You cannot use them for logical analysis. So for logicians, they are useless. They are only useful for motivational speakers, musicians, and people who like to tease people's emotions and to motivate people and so on. And then sometimes they're also good for creative thinkers, because some research is showing that creativity needs a lot of metaphorical language, to give rise to new ideas. But that's a different study entirely. By the time you get there, you'll see how metaphors are used for creativity. But they are not, you don't use them in logical reasoning, because they cannot be interpreted logically. Proverb also has a problem like that. But proverb, a proverb has both a literal and non-literal meaning. And the non-literal meaning of a proverb is usually a moral advice, So then we saw meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness. An expression is vague when its meaning has no boundaries of application. When its meaning is not precise. You'll be here any moment from now. That's vague. I'll come to see your parents at the right time. That's vague. That car is expensive. It's vague. So ambiguity, a sentence is ambiguous when it is capable of more than one meaning. I presented 3 kinds of ambiguity, which you might not find in other groups. Lexical, when the ambiguity is in just one word. And if a single word is ambiguous, we call it a homograph. Then referential ambiguity is when a certain pronoun is ambiguous. When a pronoun is ambiguous, then it's a referential ambiguity. Then we have the sentential ambiguity, when the whole sentence is ambiguous, even though the individual words are clear, the meanings of the individual words are clear, but the way the whole sentence has been put together is ambiguous. That's sentential ambiguity. Then we saw equivocation. Ambiguity could be exploited when you make use of ambiguity for the purposes of deceiving people. Then that's equivocation. When, for instance, you use a particular word, a homograph, when you use a homograph that have 2 meanings, And then you are actually using the two meanings in an argument. You use one meaning here, you use the other meaning there, and you are hoping that people are interpreting it by only one meaning. Then that's equivocation. It's a trick, an attempt to deceive people with an argument. When we had done that, then we saw the senses of law. We had said that law has many senses, and because of that, you cannot really define law as law. It's only when you are talking about a particular kind of law that you can define it. For instance, natural law, no single definition of law. It depends on the sense of law in question. When you talk about natural law, that's scientific law. Statements that describe the regularity or uniformity in the patterns of events or properties of things in the world. We form those laws based on past experiences. If all your life, all your father's life, all your grandmother's life, the sun has always risen in the east and settled in the west, then it's a law, a natural law. Then we have civil and statutory laws, which is a law we go to read in school, laws that are made by man to regulate man. And then we have cultural norms, the social conventions, social rules, all those things that regulate us in our villages, our associations, our institutions. All those things are norms, conventions, and rules, regulations. And then we have customary law, where, courts in the villages that rule based on some cultural norms that have been transformed into civil law. Then we have moral law, we have logical law, rules for reasoning, we have mathematical law, rules for mathematical operations, we have divine laws, laws that are credited with a supernatural source. And then when we were done with the senses of law, that was when we went into arguments. That was the end of the first half of the semester, in which we were studying language tools that will help us as critical thinkers. Then we got into the second part of the semester where we saw deductive reasoning. We said there are three terms. We use three words, three terms interchangeably. We use arguments, reasoning, syllogisms. We interchange them. They just mean the same thing. We have deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning. Those are the two categories of reasoning. We have causal reasoning, which is a form of inductive reasoning. So we just have two categories. And deductive is the one where the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical. Because of that, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. It's just like a mathematical operation. You don't have two conclusions in a mathematical operation. There has to be one conclusion. 2 plus 2 cannot give you two conclusions. It can only give you one. That's how deductive reasoning is. We saw examples of deductive reasoning. We saw two parts of the sentence in the deductive reasoning, reference and attribute classes. We said this reference class is the class of items to which the sentence refers. It's like a subject. And then the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to the reference class. And that's like the predicate that we already know. Then we saw the finite and infinite reference classes. Reference classes can be finite and infinite. The infinite one is the class that refers to all members or no members of the class, either 100% or 0. Then the finite reference class refers to countable members of a class between 0 and 100%. Anything between 0 and 100%. Then we have universal and particular statements. Universal statements are those statements that contain the infinite reference class. And then the particular statements are those statements that contain the finite or the countable reference class. Then we saw validity. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. And we said all valid arguments are deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are not valid. So we saw the four kinds of deductive arguments. We saw modus ponens, modus tollens, a hypothetical syllogism, and a disjunctive syllogism. And we used the if-then way of looking at a sentence to be able to analyze arguments and see what kind of arguments they are. So we cannot look at this here because this is too detailed. It takes too much time. What will happen is that if any of you is still having a difficulty with the technicality of analyzing a deductive argument, then he or she has to sign up for some tutorials or just watch the recorded session of the video carefully, and then you understand it. You shouldn't have any problems. Okay. Then we saw validity and soundness. We said that a valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. But a valid argument is not necessarily a sound argument. A valid argument is an argument, a deductive argument, whose logical relationship between the premises and conclusion is intact. But if the argument is not true, because there are some falsehoods in the premises, then it is not a sound argument. So that was the whole point of this section. And then with that, we concluded. Then we saw the inductive arguments. We're saying that in contrast to deductive arguments, inductive arguments are those arguments where the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical. You can have the premises saying one thing and then the conclusion will be saying another, and the argument is still okay. So inductive argument is an argument that is still considered as an argument, even if there's a contradiction between the premises and the conclusion. So for inductive argument, it is not necessary for the premises to be consistent with the conclusion, because the conclusion could go against the premises, since the premises cannot represent all the samples that are used in reaching the conclusion. So for inductive arguments, premises are usually not able to represent all the samples that you need to arrive at a conclusion. So that's why we say that inductive arguments are not entirely reliable, and a contradiction between the conclusion and the premises is permitted. Okay. So we call them probability arguments. And you know what probability is. Okay. We saw the distinction between verifiable and confirmable statements. Verifiable statements are statements that are verifiable. Confirmable statements are the ones you cannot verify directly, but you can use verifiable statements to analyze confirmable statements. And usually, the premises of inductive arguments are verifiable statements, and the conclusions are usually confirmable statements. And then, so with that, we saw how we can analyze inductive arguments. We said that there are two ways to detect confirmable statements. First of all, confirmable statements cannot be directly verified, and then secondly, they can be converted into conditional statements. Then we saw the finite and infinite reference classes here. We had to revisit the explanation of these classes so that it will help us to understand law-like and statistical hypotheses. Law-like hypotheses are confirmable statements that refers to all members of the class. That's the infinite reference class. And then the statistical hypotheses are confirmable statements referring to some percentage, less than 100% and more than 0. So both the law-like and the statistical hypothesis are usually conclusions of inductive arguments, and they make up the two major kinds of inductive arguments. Okay. So we also said that inductive arguments are also called, they are extrapolations. We saw different directions of extrapolation. We said we can have part-whole extrapolations, we can have analogies, and then we can have predictions. These are the three classes of extrapolation: part-whole, analogies, and predictions. The part-whole are two types. Under the part-whole, we have generalizations, and then we have statistical syllogisms. Then we just analyzed the differences between inductive arguments ending with law-like hypotheses as conclusions, which are quite risky to make. And then we also saw deductive arguments ending with conclusions that are statistical hypotheses, which are a bit safer to make. So those are the two kinds of inductive arguments we saw before we rounded up that class, and then we looked at causal reasoning. The causal reasoning was a short class which began by looking at the different senses of the word cause. Now, causal reasoning is a type of inductive reasoning that focuses on causal relationships. Causal reasoning is reasoning from cause to effect, and sometimes from effect to cause. What causes what? How do we know it is a cause? We saw different senses of the word cause. We have proximate cause, which is immediate cause of something. We have contributory cause, which is when there is one cause among many causes, or among a number of other causes. We have necessary cause, something without which the effect cannot exist. And we have sufficient cause, which is something which is sufficient to bring about the effect. We saw there's a difference between the two kinds of causes. There's a big difference between the necessary and sufficient causes. We said it is not easy to get sufficient cause, because sufficient cause might need a number of necessary causes which we are not sure is complete, because before you can have a sufficient cause. Okay. We said, for instance, that oxygen, water, food, and health are independently necessary conditions for a human being to stay alive. But they and some other factors we may not know yet are sufficient for staying alive. So a sufficient cause is usually a collection of a number of necessary causes. And the problem with arriving at a sufficient cause, an adequate cause, is to be sure that the number of necessary causes is sufficient. That's where the challenge is, because in many cases, you cannot be sure whether the number of necessary causes is sufficient. In the case of human life, you're not sure whether oxygen, water, food, and health, all of them necessary causes, can combine to become sufficient for human life. Then we have probabilistic cause, which is the opposite of necessary cause, a cause that is not necessary. For instance, it was not necessary for a crisis-ridden economy, the lack of a job, and the need to marry and settle down to lead Samson to become an armed robber. You see. Then we have causal agent, when the cause is a person. Then we have causal chain and causal web. Causal chain is when there is a chain of causes, one leading to the other. And then a causal web is when there are simultaneous causes which are acting beside each other and towards the same effect. We saw examples of each of them, and then we did some exercises, after which we Having understood the different senses of the word cause, we went ahead to study three kinds of causal reasoning. We have relevant difference reasoning, common thread reasoning, concomitant variation reasoning. The relevant difference is when you're looking for a difference that can be relevant to explaining an effect. And then the common thread is when you're looking for a commonality, something that runs through all the cases of a problem that can explain that problem. Then concomitant variation is when you are checking to see whether something that is always in the environment has increased to an intensity that is causing problems, or increased or decreased. When there is something that is always a part of the environment, but it can cause problems if the intensity is too much or too small. That's concomitant variation. So that was how we saw the three kinds of causal, informal causal reasoning. And then we saw causal fallacies, or fallacies of causal reasoning, bad causal reasoning. We saw the post hoc, ego propter hoc, or the fallacy of inferring causality from chronology. The fact that something took place before another thing. Now, or rather, the fact that A took place before B doesn't mean that A must have caused B. It's not always the case that if A happens before B, then A must have caused B. To assume that is to commit this fallacy. Then non-causal pro-causal, when you exchange a cause for an effect. Oversimplified cause is when you identify one cause, when there are many causes, and then you say that only one of them is the cause. And then false common thread is to identify a common thread that is not really the cause, a common thread. And then confusing correlation with causation is to assume that just because two things are always occurring together, then one of them must be causing the other. So correlation is not always causation. Two things can always correlate, but it is not always the case that there is a causal relationship between them. Then we have slippery slope, to assume that if A happens, then A will lead all the way to Z. And at any time A happens, Z must follow. That's slippery slope. Because sometimes A might happen and it might lead to some events that will not get to Z. Sometimes A might happen, it might lead to B, C, D, and stop at D. Or sometimes A might happen and it will lead to B, C, D, E, F, and stop at G. So to assume that anytime A happens, it must lead all the way to Z down a slippery slope. Sometimes lead to Z. Okay, so having explained slippery slope, I think that was the last of the causal fallacies. And then from there, we went on to look at informal fallacies. The informal fallacies. Now, the informal fallacies are fallacies that are not included in either deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, or causal reasoning. So those fallacies that are not included in these kinds of reasoning, those fallacies that are committed outside these kinds of reasoning, we call them the informal fallacies. So, for instance, we have fallacies of meaning. Equivocation is an informal fallacy. Secularity is an informal fallacy, defending something by repeating it. Then grandstanding, appealing to majority, is an informal fallacy, saying that something is correct because majority believe in it. Then ad hominem, attacking or praising people's personality instead of defending or rejecting their argument with reasons. So ad hominem is an informal fallacy. Illegitimate appeal to authority is an informal fallacy. Saying that people are correct because of their positions or education or qualifications is an informal fallacy. Genetic fallacy is an informal fallacy. Saying that someone is correct because he's a European, or that we should adopt someone's position because he's a fellow Ghanaian or a fellow African, that's an informal fallacy too. And then appeal to threat. Instead of convincing people to agree with you, telling them what will happen to them if they don't agree with you is an informal fallacy. Appeal to pity. When you are appealing to pity, instead of offering cogent premises or reasons. Then we have fallacies of manipulating the data. Misplaced vividness, when you are trying to displace a general argument by offering a few vivid counter examples. That's an informal fallacy. Fallacy of semi-attached figures. When you make a claim and then you support that claim with improper statistics, or statistics that don't exactly support that claim. That's what we call the fallacy of semi-attached figures. That's an informal fallacy too. And then we have hasty generalization. When you conclude for a whole population based on just a few samples. So I think that was those were the fallacies we had the time to treat this semester. If you want to know about more fallacies, then you have to go to the bookshop and buy the critical thinking book that is there. But that's for your holidays. We have no time to treat all those things. Okay, so that's the end of the semester. At this point, we can now entertain some questions from anyone that has something that is nagging him or her, so that we can answer those questions and then we end the class and upload this session. So any questions so far? Matilda? Matilda, do you have a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So please go ahead.
Please, mine is it's if uncertainty we should give the meaning why they say it's a virtue.
You have to repeat your question because it wasn't loud.
What I'm saying is, in the IE, a question came that uncertainty is a virtue. I did not understand it.
Uncertainty is a virtue.
Yes.
What were you required to do to that? So I don't understand. Were you required to agree or disagree or something?
We were to give reasons why it's a
reasons why uncertainty is a virtue.
yes.
Well, I don't think that is in the course outline. Did you see anything like uncertainty in the course outline?
No, but it came in the IE.
Yeah, so that problem has to be addressed by whoever set questions. I didn't set the questions, so and I don't understand why the question is not in the curriculum will be set. If you are required to provide reasons why uncertainty is a virtue, then it's either the examiner expects that you already know about the advantages of uncertainty, or that he or she actually taught you about uncertainty. So I think that's the only thing I can say. I don't know what else to say about that. Ikwa, you wanted to say something? Yeah, so any other questions? Okay, so if there are no other questions, then we're going to have to end the class and then upload the recorded session for others to benefit. Yeah, so someone is raising his hand. Please, can you go ahead with your question?
Okay, sir. To know the difference between the misplaced vividness and the hasty generalization.
Yeah, hasty generalization is to say that Peter is strong, James is strong, therefore all men are strong. But the misplaced vividness is to say that uh, women are not being marginalized because 3 or 4 women have been heads of state. That's misplaced vividness. To use a few vivid examples to counter a general claim is misplaced vividness. Yeah, so go ahead with your follow-up.
Okay, sir. Also, is pseudo precision, is it part of the fallacies of manipulating data, or is part of the fallacies of meaning or changing the subject?
Which one?
The pseudo precision, is it
Call,
rather part of the
uh,
fallacies that
call it again.
change the subject, or is part of the fallacy that manipulates the data?
You mean misplaced vividness or what?
Pseudo precision.
Pseudo precision.
Yes, please.
Which one is the pseudo precision? Is it the semi-attached figures?
Yes, it's like the semi-attached figures. That's the one that deals with only mathematics.
Yeah, anything that has precision problems is probably statistical.
Yes, but in your in the session, I learned you said you have 3 types of fallacies that manipulate data. That's the hasty generalization, the semi-attached figures, and the misplaced vividness. But I also read in the book that the pseudo precision is also part of the fallacies that manipulate data.
Yes, but I also said we're not treating all fallacies this semester. We just selected some to teach.
Okay, sir.
So it is your choice to go and educate yourself on other fallacies.
Okay, okay,
All right.
okay,
So
sir. Also, the fallacies that change the language. Which which part of the informal fallacies can you categorize them into?
you mean the fallacy that what changes language?
Yes, please, sir.
Change of language. Now, change of language is a very broad term. Uh, what aspect of language is being changed?
Okay, sir. Please, it was in the course reader. That's the book given to us by the school, the university.
You mean change of subject?
No, fallacy that change the language. In the book
The
I have,
point that
it is
everything we are doing can be described as language. So it can't be change of language. It must be change of something more precise.
okay, sir.
So you have to get to it and find out what it exactly is.
Okay, sir.
Good. So any other questions? Okay, so I advise you to be as hardworking as you can, reverse all your notes, do your exercises so that you'll be well prepared. Make attempts to come out in flying colors because you are preparing yourself for some sort of career in life. So you need to begin by passing your assessments and exam very well so that you set the stage for a better life, So unless we meet again in another subject, this should be goodbye.